Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is on a new book that Aurora Institute has released titled A Promise for Equitable Futures. It's about enabling systems change to scale educational and economic mobility pathways. And we're joined by author Catherine Casey. Today I'll provide a brief introduction. Catherine will dig in and examine the key ideas in the book. Then I will provide a short overview of the policy recommendations in the book, and we'll go to Q&A with brief breaks in between sessions. At Aurora, our work is to build knowledge and understanding, change policy, and bring people together to advance a vision where all people are empowered to attain the knowledge and skills necessary to achieve success, contribute to their communities, and advance society towards one that is open, just, and prosperous for all. Imagine a world where K-12 education, post-secondary, career tech ed, and the workforce are all aligned, coherent, and create universal pathways for all students, meaningful pathways for prosperous futures with an aligned P20 continuum. These changes are needed to achieve pathway systems to bring to scale, and those are the subject of the book and today's discussion. This is also a historic opportunity as the pandemic has exacerbated well-documented opportunity gaps. We must look at new ways of reinventing education and look at new ways of aligning and making it coherent, the systems to be organized around all learners throughout a lifetime. And I would just call, we can't snap back to the old traditional one-size-fits-all way of doing things. We have a system that ranks and sorts our students. It leaves huge gaps, and it clearly is not meeting all students' needs. So how do we shift our thinking and create those solutions to focus on meeting each student's needs and holistically? Next slide, please. So today, please feel free. Use the chat box to ask questions, introduce yourself, comment, and to share any insights from your own work or examples throughout today's sessions. We're also on Twitter. Please use hashtag Aurora 2020. The slides and video today's session will be archived and available on our website. All of our materials are free and open resources. So next slide. Thanks. I'm going to finish kicking off today, and we are grateful to have Dr. Catherine Casey, the founder and principal of Imagine EDU, here with us today. Right now, I will turn it over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Next slide, please, Natalie. So good afternoon, everyone. I almost said good morning, but here we are in the afternoon. Time flies. Thank you all for joining today. I hope some of you may have attended this conversation earlier in the symposium, and I'm really—
Hey, Jeremiah, can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I was having trouble with my—
some of you may have attended the symposium in October, and so excited to build on the momentum that we kicked off in that conversation to have a deeper conversation with you all today. So I echo Susan's request. Please use the chat, please engage, and please let's make this a really rich discussion. I want to begin by building on what Susan shared related to this moment in time. It's impossible to have any conversation about education right now without acknowledging where we are. And as we think about this particular and this powerful moment in our lives, I think it's important to ask ourselves whether the challenges that we are facing are aberrations, whether they are purely the result of a hopefully once in a lifetime global pandemic, or if they're really continuations of challenges that we have long faced. And to me, what I would offer this morning is that this pandemic is more of what I would call a magnifying glass than a trick mirror, right? It's exacerbating challenges that we have long faced, and it's accelerating future trends that were in place prior to the pandemic. And so three of those that we're seeing today that I think really shape and frame the themes and recommendations that Susan and I will discuss are the imperative for social and economic justice, the shift toward a lifetime continuum of education, and the emergence of learning ecosystems. So COVID-19, as we know, is widening pre-existing educational and economic inequities, all of which are related to fundamental racial inequities in our country. And contending with these inequities has always been a necessity in education, though often an unrealized or underrealized one. Today, that need is even greater. If we cannot redesign systems to close gaps in learning, in earning, in health, and in other basic rights, the reality that we face is that our democracy and economy will be irreversibly affected for decades to come. And so education today, I believe, needs sort of the equivalency of the social policies that came after World War II, albeit this time with racial equity at their core. Prior to the pandemic, it was already the case that 2/3 of jobs would require some form of higher education, and that most fields of work would require workers to upskill or reskill every 5 years. So even prior to this crisis, future forces were demanding that we begin thinking about lifelong education, not just a high school degree and a college diploma. Today, again, COVID has made these forces all the more evident. More and more young people and adults are displaced from school and work, making it imperative that our education and our employment systems find new and collaborative ways to re-engage millions of Americans. And to make this very real, the numbers are staggering. There are studies that suggest that there are today as many as 8 million opportunity youth in our country, young people ages 16 to 24 who are not in school or in work. And that is almost double the number that existed prior to the pandemic. And finally, COVID is showing us what's been true for some time, that schools play an essential role in supporting and connecting young people, and that schools cannot have the sole responsibility for shaping the next generation of citizens, workers, and leaders. With the loss of in-person schooling, which is undeniably a travesty for many communities, we are also seeing the need for other sectors, nonprofits, community centers, employers, even virtual learning platforms to step in and work alongside and around schools to connect and educate youth. And so here too, this is an acceleration of a trend that has long been underway, which is the decentralization of learning across a more diverse array of providers. Next slide, please. In our book, Susan and I describe the future of learning and work that is based in these long-standing patterns, trends, and inequities, and build on that to make the case that what is needed today is not that we tinker or fiddle with old systems, but fundamentally reimagine new ones. Specifically, that we embrace what we call the learner promise, a commitment that every learner will have access and support to discover purpose, self-determine, and pursue a certified pathway toward a meaningful chosen career, which will build social and economic capital over the course of their lives. And I just want to make a quick point from history here. I think it is telling that just over 100 years ago, in another global pandemic, American educators and policymakers enacted both the cardinal principles of secondary education, which laid the groundwork for the comprehensive American high school, as well as the Smith-Hughes Vocational Act, which laid the groundwork for vocational education. And so a century later, again in a pandemic, we have this monumental opportunity to shape the next century of education. I also very briefly here want to pause to recognize the challenge, right, of being imaginative, being hopeful, and being innovative in a time of struggle and loss. I think it's important to recognize and hold space for the fact that we have all suffered personal losses of some sort this year. And those of us who work in education are likely experiencing a level of overwhelm and exhaustion that may be unprecedented for us. And so as Susan and I talk through the big ideas and the policy opportunities in this presentation, we'll also do our best to connect back to reality, right? Back to where we are, to describe entry points, examples from practice, and just to honor you all for showing up here to be part of this conversation about possibility in a time that's very challenging. Next slide, please. So designing and actualizing a fundamentally different system of education is a challenge of systems change. And this entails seeing and understanding the current conditions that are holding the status quo in place, and then shifting those systems to support the future that we hope to see. So I will describe 7 shifts today. And again, if you attended the symposium a month back, you will have heard these before. Today, I'm excited to go a little bit deeper and also to connect them to real examples that we are seeing in the work today. Next slide, please. The first shift is one from a system of education that is organized around institutions to one that is organized around learners, right? Around learner interest, learner agency, one that develops youth power and leadership. Conversations about competency-based education or future-focused education often focused on the development of learner agency, and for very good reason. But I think too often we do this without real consideration for how we also build the foundational sense of self and sense of purpose in young people that inform the decisions they make and the paths they choose to pursue. And so this shift really emphasizes the active development of purpose. Purpose in a broad sense: who am I? What are my values? Who do I want to be in the world? And also occupational purpose, right? Which is not something that begins where it typically does, often in college or in the later years of high school, but all the way back in the early, even elementary years of education. And this shift also recognizes the deep individual and systemic biases that can shape a young person's sense of who they are and who they want to be. And so doing this work, making this shift also involves actively seeking to promote exposure and provide messaging that helps young people dismantle limiting messages. Next slide, please. To illustrate this principle, I want to actually emphasize a different element of this shift, which has to do with data, right? And so this is the role that the recognition of learning can play in enabling learner-centered environments. IMS Global is developing what they call a comprehensive learner record, which is a secure, verifiable, and learner-centric learning record that stores and supports a learner's achievements. As you can see here, including courses, competencies, skills, badges, and other demonstrations of learning in a digital format. And I think this is a powerful example of a learner-centered system because it shifts away from institution-centered education and toward one where learners own the evidence of their experiences over time, and when they can use that evidence to support advancement on a pathway of their choosing. Next slide. The second shift is one from a system that is fundamentally disconnected for many young people to one that is fundamentally relational. And so the focus here is on a system that is grounded in principles of positive development, positive youth development. This means providing systems of situated mentorship and advisement. And here I would point to powerful work being done by Big Picture Learning and the Harbor Freight Fellows, which is a powerful example, again, of engaging young people in the place of work with a professional mentor, engaging in meaningful learning and activities together. And I would also point here to the importance of providing mentorship and advisement that can sustain a young person as they navigate an increasingly decentralized system, right? So as we're asking young people to engage in learning in more places and be more self-directed, too often the impetus or sort of the onus, right, is on the learner to navigate those paths themselves. And so truly relational and connected systems provide that kind of navigation. And if this is something that you're curious about, there's some very innovative work happening here in my home state of Colorado by a group called Reschool Colorado, which has been piloting learner advocate networks for some time. Next slide. And so here I wanted just to highlight an innovation that has actually emerged during COVID. Beyond 12 is a nonprofit organization that supports college readiness and college transition for first-generation students and other students underrepresented in higher education. Their model is based deeply through a youth development lens and based on the simple truth that connection and support helps growth and advancement, particularly at critical junctures and transitions in young people's lives. And so as COVID imposed new barriers on connected and relational learning, Beyond 12 developed a system of virtual near-peer mentoring to help students not just navigate learning, but also support their health and well-being. And so I wanted to highlight this particular spotlight because I think it's an example of how this moment of challenge can also be a moment of innovation. And this is a beautiful example of connected and relational systems. Next slide. The third shift is away from a system of schooling and towards a system of learning, right? So the traditional education system that we think of is linear, it's time-bound, and it tends to value primarily or exclusively learning that happens within the four walls of a school, of a formal institution of learning, right? But learning, like many other activities and even goods and services, is becoming more and more decentralized, right? And so what we need to think about is moving towards ecosystems of learning where young people can navigate rich and personally meaningful experiences across K-12 schools, post-secondary, places of work, and even learning that they do in their community. There are many, many examples of powerful internships, pre-apprenticeships, and other forms of connected learning that exemplify this principle. Next slide, please. The one I wanted to highlight today, because I think it really beautifully exemplifies this idea of an ecosystem, is learning, or LRNG. So in their own words, they are closing the opportunity gap by transforming how young people access and experience learning and the paths they take to success. They're working with communities to build seamless work and learning pathways and a true ecosystem of connected learning. So they are putting learners at the center of their own experiences and increasing their agency through blended opportunities that span school, community, and work. Learning works in partnership with multiple cities, nonprofit organizations, school networks, and community hubs around the nation. And they create playlists that integrate both virtual and in-person learning activities, facilitated through a host of community organizations, schools, and other partners. And they are connecting these playlists to college credit and career opportunities, which is really exciting because it allows learners to apply their learning to their personal pathways, creating a porous and connected system. Next slide. Next, I want to talk about shifting from a system of learning that is narrowly academic to one that is more broadly competency-based. Right, so this begins with recognizing that to be successful today and tomorrow in a system that is much more distributed, that entails lifelong learning, as we said at the outset of this conversation, young people will certainly need a foundation of academic competency, and they will need much more. They'll need a much broader set of personal and professional knowledge and skills that enable them to self-direct and learn in the long term. So as a foundation, right, we're talking about normalizing much more integrated and broad competency frameworks as the foundation of our education system. What we're also talking about, though, is in order to allow young people to engage in that anywhere, anytime learning that I referenced in the last shift, right, we have to think differently about how we assess learning, how we assess competencies. So a critical part of this shift is a shift towards a balanced system of assessment for learning that almost always includes performance-based assessment. And what this does, as I mentioned, is it allows learners to earn credit for learning when and where it happens, shifting out of that linear, time-bound, and school-based paradigm and towards the learning ecosystem paradigm. Next slide. Here I wanted to highlight the state of Virginia, and specifically the profile of a Virginia graduate, which establishes a new set of expectations, what they call the 5 Cs, and which aligns knowledge, skills, and personal interests with career opportunities. And this, I think, is a really exciting and powerful example of a statewide effort to acknowledge and to integrate the personal, professional, and academic competencies that we know young people need. Virginia enacted the profile of a Virginia graduate in 2016, making it effective for the class of 2022. And the authorizing bill required each graduate to complete an advanced placement, honors, or international baccalaureate course or an industry certification. In 2017, the State Board of Education approved revised standards of accreditation that updated graduation requirements. And these went beyond course completion requirements to require all graduates to acquire and demonstrate foundational skills in critical thinking, creative thinking, collaboration, communication, and citizenship. And so here again, when we're thinking about doing this work at scale, this is an exciting example of a state that is leading the way. Next slide, please. The next shift that I want to talk about is a shift from a system that is highly variable to one that is certified. So in the current state, right, a student's high school diploma, even their college diploma or certificate may or may not be seen as meaningful, be accepted by employers, by schools, or by the public, right? And so we're asking our young people to invest their time and often their money to earn a piece of paper that may or may not guarantee them advancement in their learning and in their lives. And this is a real equity challenge and a real equity issue. And so what I want to present and sort of paint a picture of today is a system that is certified through universal qualification frameworks, right? Which are sort of maps, if you will, of competency demonstrations at multiple points across a learner's experience as they progress towards greater and greater levels of competency in their learning and in their career. And that is measured and demonstrated by universal credentials and recognitions of learning along the way. Next slide, please. And so probably the best example of this that we have, and Susan may touch on this in her section as well, is New Zealand. So New Zealand has created the New Zealand Qualifications Framework, which is a large-scale commitment to certifying learning pathways. It is aligned across primary and secondary education, higher education, and workforce certifications and credentials. And according to the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, they describe it as the heart of New Zealand's education system. All qualifications come with an assurance that quality is recognized and trusted worldwide. And this allows students to benchmark their level of skill and knowledge on the framework and makes it easier for countries and regions to compare qualifications. For employers, it makes explicit what graduates can do, be, and know on completion of the qualification. And for all parties, it lays out pathways to further education, employment, and a contribution to community. And here I just want to note that the population of New Zealand is just shy of 5 million people, which is roughly equivalent to states like South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Oregon. And so I think seeing this national exemplar helps us see the possibility of systems change at the state and regional levels in our own country. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about shifting from a system that is siloed to one that is fundamentally cooperative, right? And so what we see today is that K-12 education, post-secondary education, workforce, community sectors, they work often in complete isolation from one another, right? And making it much harder for young people to navigate and making it much harder, if not impossible, to think about moving toward this system of integrated and continuous learning. And so this shift entails creating systems of cross-sector governance at multiple levels, building representative leadership at multiple levels. Getting here requires some technical shifts, right? Like aligning incentives, measures, funding. It also requires deep culture shift and mindset shift, right? And so I don't want to gloss over or undermine the very human nature of getting people to work together in new ways, which is necessarily slow and challenging, but it's essential, right? And so in FSG's work on systems change, they talk a lot about the essential nature of shifting power dynamics and shifting relational structures. And so this is really getting to the heart of that, right? We have to change how people communicate, how different sectors work together by building relationships between them, and also need to really emphasize building opportunities for voice and power amongst those who are often marginalized within our systems. Next slide. Here I just wanted to quickly highlight an example of an intermediary that is helping to facilitate and sustain this shift at a regional level. So Youth Force NOLA is an example of a strong local intermediary that plays a critical role in aligning incentives, efforts, and continuous improvement across K-12, higher education, workforce, and community. In addition to convening stakeholders and supporting regional planning, Youth Force NOLA facilitates a number of really critical efforts. I'll highlight just a few today. One is Launch, which is a year-long program for New Orleans high school students to bridge to career after their senior year. This program helps students build a strong and flexible 5-year plan that leads either to immediate career placement, continued training and education, or both. And Youth Force NOLA also supports teacher training and development in local schools, helping educators increase their knowledge and skill in areas like supporting personal and professional skill development, as well as social and emotional wellness. So here we can see the role that an intermediary can play as a convener, but also as a programmatic lead in critical areas that support regional shifts. Next slide. So the final shift that I want to talk about today before passing it off to Susan is shifting from a system that is fundamentally predictive, right, where we can anticipate the life outcomes of a young person based on their zip code, to one that is equitable. And this is always and the most important shift to talk about in some ways, and also the more challenging because it is so huge. And there have been generations of social justice leaders and warriors who've been working on this for their lifetimes. Right. But what I would say is that I think we are in a moment where there is, in fact, a new imperative for thinking deeply and taking action toward achieving equity. If any of you have read Dr. Ibram Kendi's work on anti-racism, he suggests that over the course of American history, racist ideas actually follow from racist policies, right? Not the other way around. We don't hold racist beliefs or biases. We hold them because policies have made it such that they are logical for us, right? And so when we think about equity through that lens, we see that there is today a really interest-based imperative to reduce racial gaps in educational and economic attainment and mobility. And even as we grapple with what it means to live in a country that has seen growth in racial hate crime and disparity, we can also recognize that we are in a moment where the decisions that we make today about how we teach, how we allocate resources, how we approach recovery, will inform the strength or the decline of our democracy and our economy. So all this goes to say that as educators, in whatever our role, it is imperative that we think about cultivating equity in our spheres of influence and also supporting equity more broadly in the regions where we live. Next slide. And so to highlight this, I wanted to very briefly share a resource that exemplifies coordinated regional equity efforts. PolicyLink is a national research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. In their All Cities program, PolicyLink partners with cities and regions to build equitable, thriving cities. They work with cities to craft equity policy agendas, develop data infrastructure to monitor policies and programs, and engage in place-based field building activities to implement cross-sector strategies. And so I share this because I think it is important to recognize that while equity must absolutely be a school-based effort, achieving equity also relies on our collective willingness to build a new social infrastructure that supports and promotes real opportunity and real equity, especially as we approach recovery. And so in keeping with the theme of collective and cooperative efforts, we encourage education leaders to partner broadly to advance equity in communities. Next slide. And so before I pass it back to Susan or pause for questions, I'll just sort of circle back to where we started, which is the call to action in this moment, and recognizing that throughout history, we've seen that radical innovation, radical systems change comes in moments of radical disruption when we sort of lose the ground beneath us and lose access to the status quo that we've known, and that however painful those moments may be, they create space for something new. So I'll pause there. Susan or Natalie, any questions that we want to talk about from the chat before I pass it over to you?
Yeah, there's one comment and then one question, and the question's from Sean Messmer, and he says, a big challenge when legislated by the state, and this is focused on competency-based education, as local control of K through 12 school districts. In his research, he's found the biggest impediments to successful implementation of competency-based education is a shallow understanding of competency-based education, and then 1,000 different interpretations of what it is and what it is not in the implementations. And I know that we've been following the developments in Maine since that legislation for requiring a proficiency-based diploma occurred. I was actually in the state of Maine when that legislation was signed by the governor. I believe that was in 2012. And since then, I think we've learned some lessons on a lot of this work on the ground in terms of implementation is coming from the ground up in terms of K through 12 school districts wanting to shift to a system that's built around learning. What this book is talking about are these broader systems change and alignment at different levels. And I would just say, like, kind of turning this question over to you, Catherine, is like, I know that since then we put a real focus on quality and published a quality book on what high quality implementation of competency-based ed is. But it's also true that when a state has legislation requiring 100% of schools and districts to move in this direction, it is absolutely critical to build educator capacity. And I know in this short time period, we didn't have time to go into all of the parts of the book that do talk about building capacity for this systems change with people at all levels, including with educators, and also the equity strategies that are absolutely critical when you're building competency-based models. And I know Elliot is on the line. If he could drop in a link to our paper on what is competency-based education with the definition and those quality frameworks. But let me turn it over to you. That's a long tee up for that really important question.
I appreciate the tee up for a second to get my thoughts together, because this is such a great and important point. So, I think about state legislation or any policy change, right, as being often a necessary enabling condition, right, creating opportunity for folks who are ready and willing, rather than a barrier. And it can also play a role in expectation setting, right, setting a new bar, setting a new benchmark. But the challenge that you're describing, I think, is so real, right, because when we ask people to make a shift that is compliance oriented, and compliance oriented change is sort of the antithesis, right, of a competency-based self-directed model. When we find ourselves in a place of compliance-based adoption, we know that it won't last, right? So then the question becomes, how do we move beyond compliance and get to a shift in culture and get to sort of a groundswell of adoption and further innovation. And so a couple of things that I think about that. One is I think about the importance of having learning infrastructure and learning systems. So systems all the way from teacher development, professional development, thinking about how we train and develop people before they enter the profession and how we support them while they're in the profession. And then also how we think about the systems of learning that they are engaging in within their school, across their networks and school and statewide. And so I've seen examples, I believe, from Vermont, sort of regional hubs for professional training and knowledge dissemination. And I think that really grounded and organic approach to learning is very essential. I also think that, Richard Elmore talks often about sort of like reciprocity in our accountability systems, and how if we are going to ask for major change, we have to meet that with support in equal measure. And too often in education, we're demanding change from educators with little to no support behind it. And so I think when states begin to think about enacting these new legislations, they also have to think about how does our system of accountability for schools and for educators align with that, right, to make space for the learning, for the challenges, for the growth pains that inevitably come with that at the local level, right down to sort of the microcosm of the individual classroom. So I'll pause there because I could just keep running, but I appreciate the question. And as Susan said, this book is really emphasizing sort of painting the picture of the systems change. And I'm so eager and excited to also get down to the level of like, yeah, but how do we do this? And what roadblocks do we know from the leaders in the field? What roadblocks do we know that we might face?
Yeah, thanks for the question again. And Natalie, if you can go to the next slide, it's actually a nice place to pivot. There's so many policy questions when you come in here. And in this book, one of the things, Catherine, that I most appreciate is not only is painting this really important vision on we can build a bridge from where we are today to acknowledge what a system could look like that could create these universal pathways and equitable pathways for all learners, and like invest in a promise that says when you demonstrate this learning that happens anywhere, anytime, there is a framework to get recognized for the skills, for the fonts of knowledge and your assets that you develop over time. That's really critical. And the New Zealand example is the best I've seen anywhere in the world. And it's interesting, there are a number of states in the US right now that are starting to work towards this vision. And for those of you that are interested, I'll point to the National Governors Association work too in pathways. States like Alabama and Washington State are starting down this journey. So I'm really encouraged. And what I'm going to do here is shift and take a look at the policy recommendations that are in the report. Brookings Institution has done some work in education systems globally and looked at what education systems that have actually leapfrogged in major changes have done. And a lot of the work is in how they address aligning their learning ecosystems, which is exactly in line with what we're talking about today. So next slide, please. In the book, we're examining this broader call to action for states, and this gets into policy to commit to this learner promise. And there are 14 articulated policy recommendations that are around creating this vision of an aligned, coherent, competency-based system across education and the workforce at all levels, at K through 12, at post-secondary, career tech ed, and the workforce. And it is a collective call to develop an equity-driven system for lifelong learning in the US. And I will tell you, this just came out recently. The Education Commission of the States, ECS, announced that in the last year alone, legislatures had 300 bills related to pathways. And this will draw back on what Catherine just presented. They characterize them in a few different areas. One is around data and comprehensive learner records, moving in that direction for a learner record that's owned by the individual youth or person over a lifetime, not the institution as much. Reorganizing governance models and realigning these pathways, as well as the leadership needed. So governors are coming together to try to pull together the workforce, the education agencies, and think about how this alignment might happen, as well as absolutely critical conversations across states and regions and even local areas in certifications and qualifications to be more competency-based. So next slide, please. And there's a picture of the cover of the report. Elliot, I don't know if you can drop a link to the actual book there. So when we talk about building this bridge from the existing traditional kind of K through 12 education system towards this vision of a learning ecosystem over a lifetime that is aligned, it really is this notion of universal pathways. And we're looking at it to create a system that is learner-centered, that is equitable, that honors competency development inside and outside of formal institutions, that are recognized with recognizing sort of credential or micro-credential based on evidence much like when a young person or an adult goes and gets a driver's license, there is a performance that has to happen up to a certain standard where you get that credential, which is a driver's license. If you think about the needs that we have right now in 2020 to learn and work anytime, anywhere, how do we make sure that we're organized and we're sharing those qualifications frameworks, and that the data systems or that learner record is transparent and actually is backed up by meaningful credentials and meaning evidence of that work? So next slide, please. So in this, this is actually from Global Best Practice in Supporting Learning Ecosystems. This comes from a report that talks about this trend. It's happening around the globe. It is happening in all corners of the globe, asking how learners can weave their experiences of learning together over time, how we can create in our education systems and greater workforce systems a common infrastructure. This idea of universal qualifications is something that is globally discussed right now. Rethinking for meaningful credentials and new credentialing frameworks is something that is a very common conversation that is happening all over the world as the future of work is changing, as the future of education is changing. And there is this group that I'm part of globally that is asking about recognitions of learning. And recognitions of learning means that no matter where a student learns a skill or knowledge, that there is some entity, there is some way of recognizing and validating the learning. It is focused on having transferability of credits and credentials and getting to move to more aligned, coherent, shared governance systems. So next slide. And I'm going to go pretty quickly here, but just knowing that our current way of thinking about assessment is extremely, I would say, limited, that we are really going to be challenged to think about what does it mean when a youth can like demonstrate knowledge and skills in different way, or an adult through a lifetime. So our assessment systems are very reliant on a way of standardized assessments and local determination of letter grades in K through 12. And these are insufficient when we look at pathway systems. So building our muscle in assessment literacy, getting better at valuing work-based learning or prior learning, or learning that happens outside of inside and outside of classrooms is really important. And understanding how only crediting the kind of learning that happens that's sort of standardized and in the classroom is in ways inherently biased, and moving beyond that. Next slide, please. So in state policy, what is it that state policymakers can do to create learning ecosystems and pathways? And I'm not going to read through all of the words, but I'm just going to lift up and highlight. We are seeing states today start to authorize innovation zones. Sometimes the innovation zones are designed in states with state education agencies to help give space for public school districts to try and move to more competency-based models. There are potentials for innovation zones that are regional or even within a district. There are potentials for innovation zones that are across the state that is asking for more alignment between K through 12, post-secondary, and the workforce. There are policies that can be put into place that help enable this alignment and qualifications frameworks and competency-based systems, graduate profiles. You see a lot of work in Profile of a Graduate happening around the country. Some of that originates in communities, and it's putting pressure up on the state to do the kind of work that Virginia has done, that Catherine mentioned, South Carolina, Idaho. Many states are moving to this redefining what students need to know and be able to do upon graduating, and that is coming from the ground up and influencing a state sort of North Star to getting started. Enabling anytime, anywhere learning is crucial. Most states have experienced challenges with even some flexibility from seat time with school closures during COVID. So how do we move away from seat time as our proxy for learning and enable competency-based credits and credentials that have demonstrations of mastery? So let's go on to the next slide. There is a lot of work that is starting to happen in how we better organize and coordinate across the state through regional approaches. And this is absolutely essential. We need to also streamline the planning across education and the workforce. So you see some states like Vermont, like Alabama, looking at their federal ESSA funds, their WIOA funds, their Perkins funds, and blending and braiding revenue streams to start to shift, to make this shift to pathways. Next slide. And finally, really looking at addressing some of the major systemic issues. There are over 30 states right now that are looking at their school funding formulas and the inequities in their funding formulas. This is an important, critical, historical issue across the US in every state. So as we're looking at funding formulas and inequities, go deep into the root causes and look at how we can help promote equitable futures, equitable pathways for students, but also equitable economic development for communities across states, across the US. And finally, it is really important that we're engaging diverse stakeholders in these conversations to help share stories, experiences, and plan and scale innovations. The last thing I just want to mention is, you can go to the next slide, is there is a big theme throughout this paper on scaling innovation, and Catherine's done this amazing literature review on scale. And scale is not just taking one particular model and replicating that. Scale has a lot of different depth of meaning in terms of where local context creates environments for these pathway models. It may be that scale means that they go deeper and impact more opportunities and more pathways. And maybe we'll get some questions around the scaling too, but I just wanted to point to that. So this is an overall snapshot of the policies across the book in terms of, this is about modernizing human capital systems across education, but also across the broader learning ecosystem and for the future of work too. So next slide, and I will wrap up my portion, please. At Aurora, we have been working on these entry points for K-12 education and competency-based systems, and you'll see on the left, absolutely critical as a North Star first step is redefining what students need to know and be able to do, profile of a graduate. There are a number of states getting started, and we have flexibility in some policies in 49 out of 50 states. There are states creating innovation zones, creating competency-based ed task forces that have credit flexibility, that have pilot programs that are allowing multiple pathways to graduation. So there is a lot of work happening in pockets of innovation around the country. When you go further to more advanced developed policies to the right side of this slide, getting to comprehensive statewide policies approach, people are at different stages and getting started, really looking towards a vision that is presented in this book of Equitable Futures of pathways for P20 alignment. So next slide, please. And that is just sort of a summary coming back to the pieces that Catherine walked through of her book in looking at these shifts that are putting the development of youth and learners at the center with their assets and the assets across the community. Purpose is key, and moving towards alignment for pathways to ensure a new dawn for every learner. So next slide. And with that, I'll put a pause on the policy section and just ask to open it up for any questions for Catherine or on policy. So let me take a look at the chat. Or Catherine, did you see any questions or did you want to make any comments?
Sure, yeah. I'll just sort of describe a couple of threads through the conversation in one question. And as I'm doing that, please, folks, would love for you to add in any other questions that you have for us to address. One, just sort of picking up where we left off, there were some comments about the importance of policy as enabling innovators by removing barriers, but drawing from some experiences, folks were reflecting on how policy efforts fall flat when they mandate. And so I think that sort of was echoing the point about kind of bottom up and top down approaches, but bottom up needing to be the source of change. And then just some candid reflections on, being years and decades into the work and still struggling with consistent implementation, which I think is a reminder that this is continuous work and continuous improvement work. And there is no short path to transformation. There are a lot of comments right now about just the importance of removing seat time and how efforts to change graduation profiles, change other parts of a system without sort of releasing teachers and students from seat time will really fall flat. And so would invite any other sort of commentary in the chat about success or challenges there. And there was one question that I just wanted to highlight. I think a few of us tried to answer in the chat, but there was one question also about looking for examples of states or institutions that have shifted their higher education admissions policies or practices. And so I know Southern New Hampshire was named, and I talked a little bit about the work that Mastery Transcript Consortium is beginning to do with some higher ed partners around this work. But Susan, not to put you on the spot, but wondering if you have other sort of examples that you would point to or call out.
Yeah, there's actually a national initiative right now, which is pretty groundbreaking, and it's called Reimagining College Access. And it is about that exactly. It is about getting a group, and there are groups of well-known, I would say, institutions in higher education as well as in K through 12 to start shifting admissions policies to be more focused on competency-based education. So again, that's Reimagining College Access. And maybe we can drop the link in the chat here. Linda Darling-Hammond, who's on the State Board of Education in California, is deeply involved in that effort. There are universities, the UC system has been involved in those conversations, University of Michigan, University of Virginia, MIT. MIT actually has a program, I don't want to call it quite a pilot, but a program in admissions that is giving alternatives to standardized testing for sort of a capstone portfolios of student work, which is right in line. There are a number of universities right now with COVID, with 2020, that are not going to be using the standardized tests for their admissions. So there is a real opportunity to begin to break open changes in college admissions, which is absolutely key. It's a great point. I do think this notion, I saw the comments from Houston on moving to profile of a graduate, but the restrictions from Carnegie units being based on seat time, it ends up really being a major barrier to moving systems in this direction. And I would just echo that. I think that there are some discussions at policy levels in states or even nationally that say, well, all of these states have some flexibility in seat time, they can get started. And the answer is they can get started, but when you really start doing the work and articulating it, if you don't address with the other aspects of the system and the barriers that seat time and the construction of Carnegie units based on seat time is extremely limited. So I just want to acknowledge that is real. And I find that too many policy discussions feel like once you have some flexibility in seat time, you're there, and there's much more work to be done.
I would just build quickly, Susan, and I think to your point about the opportunity alongside the challenge that COVID presents, the opportunity that sits alongside the travesty of, losing so many children's engagement, attendance, and participation during COVID is a very real need for school systems to figure out how do we move forward in a way that has more than two options, which is fail or pass our children, right? And so I think K-12 schools and school systems are currently struggling with this question. How do we think beyond the seat time unit that we've been using? So I think there is an opportunity there, as well as you mentioned, for institutes of higher education that frankly are bleeding students and bleeding dollars and trying to, for very well-intended reasons and very practical reasons, think very differently about how do we get students into our institution and think more broadly about what it is that they can bring with them as evidence of their readiness for learning. So just want to echo the opportunities in this moment around these issues of time and admissions.
Yeah, and there are more comments too on the graduate profiles and the constructs or limitations of the Carnegie unit. I don't know if you want to talk any about the Mastery Transcript Consortium, or I can. I know in the opening of the symposium, which was on October 26th, and Catherine keynoted on this book. They were short 10-minute TED Talks, so we're able to go deeper today. Stacy Caldwell from Mastery Transcript Consortium did a bright spot afterwards too, for this very reason. There is this effort happening in the US called Mastery Transcript Consortium. So can you talk a little bit about how do you go from the graduate profile beyond, like, how do you break free of the Carnegie unit and change that? I mean, do you have thoughts on that, Catherine? I know you've done some work with them too, or I'm happy to.
Yeah, certainly. I'm sorry, Susan. I thought you were asking someone else to chime in. I was like, we have someone from Mastery Transcript on the call. This is great. But you were referring to me. My apologies. Yeah, I think I was able to do a little bit of work with Mastery Transcript pre-COVID and was really excited by sort of their change theory, right, which is both about developing a proof of concept. And frankly, they're starting often in the independent school space where there is a little bit more flexibility, but working really hard to partner with schools that are public as well, but trying to build a strong proof of concept of not just what a new transcript can do for student mobility and student transition, but also for student learning. So sort of using the transcript both as an opportunity to think about advancement and also about the shift to mastery learning in high school. And at the same time, beginning to work with, with groups of folks from higher ed in admissions to really understand kind of the problem and pain points that they already have around admissions, and trying to work with them to identify spaces where innovation can actually help them admit diverse student bodies, admit student bodies that are there for learning, there to pursue passion, that will stay, that will be committed to the school, really playing to and exploring the different incentives that admissions officers have that they can't actually get to with the limited but tested and true, or tested at least, measure of standardized assessment. So that's just a very, very little bit about their change theory. I don't know, Susan, if you want to share a little bit more about what they're learning or what you may have been working with Stacy on more recently.
I would just point folks to Mastery Transcript Consortium because we're running out of time here and wrapping up. I just wanted to say it does kind of point back to if you look at the New Zealand example, where New Zealand set up their qualifications frameworks in pre-K, K through 12, in post-secondary, in CTE, career tech ed, and across each industry from bricklayers to drywall hangers to firefighters, lawyers, teachers, doctors, the whole range of industries, certifications and licensures are competency-based, and they all align over a lifetime. And think about, there was a comment on micro-credentials. In some ways, it is like stacking micro-credentials over time, and you can get some micro credentials and your skills in graphic design while still pursuing becoming a doctor or any range of fields, so that they're not closed or tracked, but they're open. And this idea that of universal qualifications. And this idea of micro credentials, where like in New Zealand, level 1, level 2 is, have you demonstrated literacy level 1? You get your, essentially, they don't call it a badge, but like you get your credential. Have you demonstrated numeracy? Have you demonstrated literacy? Imagine what our elementary, middle, high school, like through those levels, we would not be graduating so many students in the US in high school that have to go on, 40% have to get remediation, because we would know they would have literacy, numeracy, and the range of other skills as identified through these graduate profiles that would build over time and that would allow what we think of as like dual enrollment, but industry certifications, all to have a coherent, aligned framework. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just the last slide. Please consider filling out our 1-minute survey about today's webinar. We love your feedback and comments and use that to help in the work that we do. As a reminder, the session was recorded and will be shared with you via email in the coming days. And join me again in thanking author Catherine Casey for all of her amazing work and leadership in the field. Thank you, Catherine, for being here today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to all of you. I hope we have more.
Yeah, come back. We'll join us and check out our website, and we will have more conversations to come. Thanks again, and bye-bye, everyone.